The silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains is not a lack of sound, it is an active pressure, a physical weight that settles into the marrow of your bones and stays there until you forget what it feels like to be light. I had rented Unit 44 because I was tired of the noise of a city that never stopped screaming, a life that had become a series of jagged notifications and hollow conversations. I wanted the void. I wanted the dark. I didn't realize that when you step into the void doesn't just look back, it moves in. The cabin was a skeletal structure of cedar and glass, designed to make you feel like you were floating above the valley, but the moment I stepped over the threshold, I felt less like I was floating and more like I was being watched by the very terrain I had come to admire. The air was thin and tasted of ancient ice, and for the first 48 hours, the isolation was a luxury. I slept in a bed that felt like a cloud, ignored my dead phone, and watched the mist roll through the pines like the breath of some sleeping giant. It was on the third evening, as the sun began to bleed a deep, bruised purple over the horizon, that the clock on the wall, a heavy, brass-rimmed thing, gave a final, metallic shudder and stopped. The hands were frozen at 4:44 p.m. I took it down to check the batteries, and that was when the parchment fell out. It was thin, yellowed, and felt like it had been pressed between the pages of a Bible for 100 years. There were no pleasantries, no welcome to the mountains, just a list of instructions written in a hand so cramped it looked like the writer's fingers were breaking as they moved. Rule 1, the horizon check. At sunset, count the peaks. There should be 7. If there are 8, do not look at the 8th. I laughed at that, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the room's heavy curtains. I stood at the window, the glass cold against my forehead, and I counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I breathed a sigh of relief, my breath fogging the pain. But as I pulled away, my eyes caught a sliver of movement. Far to the left, behind the jagged spine of the 7th peak, a needle-thin spire of obsidian was rising. It wasn't a mountain. It was too straight, too black, and it was swaying with a slow, rhythmic motion that made my stomach churn. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to blink, and the moment my eyelids closed, the world seemed to shift. When I opened them, the 8th peak wasn't in the distance anymore. It was closer. It was larger. It looked like a finger pointing at the sky, or perhaps, a finger pointing at me. I slammed the curtains shut and backed away into the center of the room, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The darkness outside felt different now. It wasn't the peaceful dark of the forest, it was the suffocating dark of a closet. I tried to turn on the lights, but the bulbs only flickered with a dim, sickly orange glow before dying out completely. The smell followed shortly after. It started as a faint whiff of wet copper, the unmistakable scent of blood, mixed with the cloying, sugary sweetness of old lilacs, the kind you find at a funeral home. Rule 6, I remembered. The nightmarish scent. It wasn't a hallucination. It was an arrival. I sat on the floor, the only place that felt stable, and that was when the kitchen started to whistle. It wasn't the friendly, domestic whistle of a tea kettle. It was a high, piercing shriek that vibrated in my teeth. I hadn't touched the stove. I hadn't even filled the kettle. The sound grew louder, more desperate, as if the air itself was screaming to be let out of a pressurized chamber. I wanted to run in there and turn the burner off, but the rule said the stove wasn't the source. The rule said the sound was a lure. I covered my ears, but the whistle bypassed my eardrums, echoing directly in my skull. I began to hum. I chose a song my grandmother used to sing, a simple, nonsensical tune about a bird in a cage. I hummed until my throat felt raw, until the whistle changed from a shriek into a frustrated clicking sound like thousands of fingernails tapping against a marble floor. The clicking moved. It didn't stay in the kitchen. It migrated to the hallway, rhythmic and slow. Creak. 1. Creak. 2. Creak. 3. I froze. The rules had been very specific about the hallway. 3 creaks meant something was standing outside the door. I stared at the wood of the bedroom door, watching the gap at the bottom. A pale, gray light began to leak through, flickering like a dying television set. I could hear breathing now, but it wasn't the breathing of a human. It was a wet, heavy rasp, like someone trying to inhale through a throat full of sand. Open the door, the voice said. It wasn't my mother's voice this time. It was mine. It was my own voice, with my own cadence, my own subtle stutters. I've found the 8th peak, Christian. It's made of glass. It's made of everyone who lived here before you. Come see. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard I saw sparks. The handle began to turn. It was a slow, agonizing rotation, the metal groaning under the pressure of a hand that didn't know its own strength. I lunged forward, grabbing the brass knob and pulling it back toward me with every ounce of strength I had left. The resistance was immense. It felt like I was playing tug-of-war with a machine. The scratching began then not on the door, but on the other side of the wall, right behind where my head was resting. Something was trying to dig its way through the cedar. The mirror, the voice whispered through the wood. Check the mirror, Christian. See what I've written for you. I didn't want to look. I knew that if I turned my head toward the bathroom, I would see the fog, and I would see the truth. But the human mind is a treacherous thing, it craves the very images that will destroy it. I turned my head. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and the mirror was indeed coated in a thick, gray mist. Letters were forming, dripping down the glass like tears. SAVEYOURSELF. But as I watched, the letters changed. They blurred and reformed into a single word, OCCUPIED. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The rules weren't meant to keep the things out. They were meant to tell me that I was already trapped inside with them. The cabin wasn't a shelter, it was a digestive tract. I looked back at the hallway door. The handle had stopped turning. The light had vanished. There was only the smell of lilacs and the sound of my own frantic breathing. I knew I couldn't stay in the bedroom. If I stayed, the walls would eventually finish their closing act. I had to go to the basement. I had to find the tunnel. I had to find the man at the desk. The basement door didn't groan when I opened it, it exhaled. A draft of air that felt several degrees colder than the rest of the cabin rushed up to meet me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like a pile of old coins. I didn't have a flashlight. Rule 7 was burned into the back of my eyelids, the things in the dark can smell electricity. I moved by touch, my left hand skimming the rough-hewn cedar of the wall while my right hand reached out into the oppressive blackness. Every step down the wooden stairs felt like a betrayal of my own survival instincts. The wood chirped under my weight, a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Down here, the silence was absolute, yet it felt crowded. It felt as though the dark was composed of thousands of small, unblinking eyes, all tracking the heat of my body as I descended deeper into the belly of the peak. When my feet finally hit the concrete floor of the basement, the texture was wrong. It wasn't smooth or cold, it felt slightly tacky, like half-dried paint. I followed the wall, my fingers catching on splinters and cobwebs that felt like wet silk, until I felt the cold, industrial steel of the water heater. Behind it, just as the paper had promised, was the door. It was small, barely 3 feet high, made of a wood so old it felt like charcoal. I crawled inside. The tunnel was a throat. That was the only way to describe it. The walls weren't stone or dirt, they were lined with something organic and pulsing, a rhythmic thrumming that I could feel in the soles of my feet. I crawled on hands and knees, the narrow passage pressing in on my shoulders, forcing me to breathe in shallow, jagged gasps. This was the transition. This was where the Blue Ridge Mountains ended and the nightmare cycle truly began. I counted my breaths to keep from screaming. 1, 2, 3. The air grew thicker, smelling of those damn lilacs again, but now the scent was so strong it was nauseating, like rotting fruit. I realized then that the tunnel wasn't straight. It was curving downward in a spiral, deeper than the foundation of any cabin should go. I thought about the 8th peak, the obsidian finger I had seen swaying in the twilight. I realized with a jolt of horror that I wasn't under the mountain anymore. I was inside the finger. I was climbing down the throat of the thing that had been standing behind the 7th peak. The darkness began to change. It wasn't getting lighter, but it was becoming translucent, a deep, bruised indigo that allowed me to see the outlines of things that shouldn't exist. The walls of the tunnel were covered in shoes. Thousands of them. Work boots, high heels. Children's sneakers, all fused into the organic matter of the walls, as if the tunnel had swallowed people whole and kept only their footwear as a trophy. I stopped moving when I heard the scratching. It wasn't behind me anymore. It was beneath me. Something was moving inside the floor of the tunnel, keeping pace with my crawl. A voice drifted up through the floor, muffled and distorted. "You're late, Christian," it said. It wasn't my voice this time. It was a chorus, 100 voices speaking in perfect unison, a terrifying harmony of men, women, and children. "The ink is drying. The pen is heavy. We've been waiting for a new hand to hold it." I pushed forward, my palms raw and bleeding, driven by a primal terror that eclipsed my exhaustion. The tunnel opened up suddenly into a chamber that defied the laws of geometry. The ceiling was lost in a swirling vortex of gray fog, and the floor was a perfectly flat, reflective surface of black liquid that didn't ripple when I stepped onto it. In the center of the room sat a desk. It was a simple, wooden desk, identical to the one in the cabin above, and sitting at it was a figure. From the back, the silhouette was mine. The same slump of the shoulders, the same messy hair, the same frayed sweater I had bought 3 years ago. The figure was writing. I could hear the frantic scratch of a fountain pen on parchment. As I approached, the smell of copper became overwhelming. The black liquid on the floor wasn't ink, it was blood that had been filtered through the mountain for decades. I reached the desk and the figure stopped writing. It didn't turn around. It didn't have to. I could see its reflection in the floor. It had no face. Where the eyes and mouth should have been, there were only lines of text, tiny, cramped handwriting etched directly into the skin. "I broke the rules," the figure said, and the words appeared on its skin as it spoke them. I looked at the peak. I entered the kitchen. I wiped the mirror. And now, I am the rule maker. It held out the pen. It was made of bone, sharpened to a needle point, and the reservoir was filled with the dark, copper-scented liquid from the floor. The cycle requires a witness. It requires someone to document the dread so that the mountain can feed on the fear of those who come after. If you don't take the pen, the 8th peak will lean down and swallow the valley. But if you take it, the valley stays safe. For a while. I looked at the parchment on the desk. It was the same list I had found behind the clock, but at the bottom, there was a long list of signatures. Thousands of names, stretching back over a century. Some were written in elegant cursive, some in shaky prints, some were just bloody thumbprints. The last name on the list was mine, but the ink was still wet, shimmering in the indigo light. I realized the trap then. The rules weren't there to help me survive, they were a training manual. By following them, I had proven myself capable of the discipline required to maintain the nightmare. By resisting the guest in the hallway, I had shown the strength to hold the pen. The figure stood up, its movements jerky and mechanical, like a puppet on invisible strings. It stepped away from the desk and dissolved into a cloud of black moths that swirled up into the fog above. I was alone. The desk waited. The pen waited. I looked back at the tunnel, but the opening was gone. There was only the endless, black liquid and the swaying shadow of the eighth peak visible through the ceiling of fog. I sat down. My hand moved toward the pen of its own accord. I didn't want to write, but my fingers closed around the bone-white barrel, and the nib touched the parchment. I began to write the first line. Rule 1, the horizon check. As I wrote, I felt my own face begin to itch. I felt the skin of my cheeks tightening, the ink of the words I was writing beginning to manifest on my own forehead. I wasn't just writing the rules. I was becoming them. I would sit here in the dark, in the heart of the obsidian spire, until the next tenant arrived at Unit 44. I would listen to their footsteps on the floorboards above. I would whistle in their kitchen. I would fog their mirror. And eventually, I would lead them down here to take my place. I began to write, but the words didn't feel like they were coming from my mind, they were being pulled out of my blood. The bone pen was hot in my hand, and every time the nib scratched the parchment, I felt a sharp, stinging pain in my chest, as if the ink was being drawn directly from my heart. I wrote about the seventh peak. I wrote about the kettle. I wrote about the things that crawl in the subflooring of reality. As I wrote, the room around me began to expand. The black liquid on the floor started to rise, swirling around the legs of the desk, but it didn't wet the paper. It was as if the desk and I were on an island of dead time. I looked up from the ledger and saw that the walls of the chamber were no longer shadows. They were shelves. Thousands upon thousands of shelves stretching up into the infinite gray void above, and every shelf was packed with jars. Inside the jars were flickers of light shivering, pale blue flames. I realized with a jolt of cold terror that these weren't flames. They were memories. The mountain didn't just want my fear, it wanted my history. It wanted the smell of my first home, the sound of my father's laugh, the feeling of the rain on my wedding day. One by one, I felt these things being plucked from my brain and bottled on the shelves. The more I wrote, the more hollow I became. I forgot the color of my mother's eyes. I forgot the name of the street where I grew up. My past was being traded for the preservation of the rules. I was becoming a vessel, a hollowed-out husk filled with nothing but the clinical, cold instructions of the nightmare. I looked down at my hands. The skin was turning the color of old parchment, and my veins were turning black. I wasn't Christian anymore. I was the curator of Unit 44. Suddenly, the ceiling of the chamber began to vibrate. I heard a sound that made my non-existent heart freeze. It was the sound of a car engine. High above me, miles up through the rock and the throat of the mountain, a new car was pulling up the gravel driveway. I heard the door slam. I heard the crunch of footsteps on the porch. A new tenant had arrived. I felt a surge of predatory hunger that wasn't mine. It belonged to the mountain. My hand flew across the paper, writing new rules, cruel rules, rules designed to break this newcomer faster than I had been broken. I wrote about a telephone that only rings when you're in the shower. I wrote about a shadow that stays in the room after you turn the lights off. I wrote because I had to. If I didn't keep the newcomer occupied, if I didn't guide them down the spiral, then the eighth peak would have nothing to eat but me. I stood up from the desk, my movements stiff like a rusted machine. I walked to the wall of memories and grabbed a jar. It was a memory of a summer afternoon, a picnic by a lake. I smashed it against the floor. The blue flame flared up and turned into a thick, gray mist, the same mist that fogs the bathroom mirror. I sent the mist upward, through the cracks in the stone, through the floorboards of the cabin. I leaned in close to the ceiling of the chamber and whispered, my voice echoing through the ventilation ducts of the house above. "Welcome home," I said, and as I spoke, I saw the new tenant's face in my mind. He looked just like I used to. He was reaching for the clock on the wall. He was about to find the paper. The cycle was beginning again. The eighth peak swayed in the wind outside, its obsidian skin shimmering in the moonlight. It was hungry. And I, the faceless rider in the dark, was ready to serve the first course. I sat back down at the desk, picked up the bone pen, and waited for the first creak of the floorboards. 1, 2, 3. I smiled, even though I no longer had a mouth. The new tenant's footsteps were heavy, uncoordinated, the sound of someone who still believed in the solidity of the world. I watched him through the eyes of the cabin itself. I felt his weight on the cedar planks, I felt the heat of his palm as he brushed against the doorframe. He was young, perhaps 10 years younger than I had been when I arrived, with a face that hadn't yet been etched by the specific kind of exhaustion that drives a man to the mountains. He moved through the rooms with a frantic energy, opening cupboards, testing the faucets, trying to claim a space that had already claimed him. I waited until the sun touched the edge of the seventh peak. It was time for the first harvest. I reached out with a thought, a silent command to the geography of the valley, and the eighth peak responded. It rose from the shadows of the gorge, a silent, jagged needle of impossibility. I felt the tenant's heart rate spike as he stood at the northern window. I felt his disbelief turn into a cold, curdling dread. He blinked just like I had, and the peak lunged forward, eating the distance between the horizon and the porch. In the basement chamber, the walls began to weep. The black liquid, the blood of the previous 100 years, dripped from the shelves of memories, pooling around my feet. The pen in my hand began to vibrate, humming with the frequency of the tenant's fear. It was a beautiful, terrible sound. I began to write the midsection of the ledger, the part that deals with the erosion of the self. Rule 9, the echo in the drain. If you hear your own voice calling from the bathtub drain, do not answer. It is collecting the parts of you that you discard. If you speak to it, you will wake up the next morning with no voice at all, and your reflection will be the one screaming. I heard the tenant stumble in the kitchen. He had found the kettle. The whistle was high and pure tonight, a silver thread of agony that wound its way through the ventilation. I watched him cover his ears. I watched him try to find the logic in the noise. He didn't know the song yet. He didn't know how to hum the past to keep the present at bay. I felt a flicker of pity, a ghost of the man I used to be, but it was quickly crushed by the mountain's insatiable void. The floorboards above me began their tally. Creak. 1. He was in the hallway now, his back pressed against the wall. Creak. 2. He was hyperventilating, the thin mountain air failing to fill his lungs. Creak. 3. He stared at his bedroom door, his eyes wide, looking for the light. I gave it to him. I reached into the static of the abyss and pulled out a flickering, gray radiance. I pushed it through the floorboards, painting the hallway in the light of a dead world. "Is someone there?" he whimpered. I didn't answer with words. I answered with the smell. I released the scent of the lilacs and the copper, a thick, suffocating cloud that filled the cabin. I wanted him to feel the weight of the history he was standing on. I wanted him to understand that every breath he took was borrowed from the lungs of the men who had died in Unit 44 before him. The tenant began to cry, a soft, broken sound that echoed through the pipes and into my chamber. It was music to the 8th peak. The spire swayed outside, its tip brushing against the stars, drawing energy from the boy's collapse. But he wasn't broken enough yet. He hadn't found the basement. He hadn't seen the tunnel. I turned the page of the ledger. The parchment was getting heavier, turning into a slab of stone under my touch. The names at the bottom were beginning to glow with a faint, sickly green light. My own name was there, right above the empty space where his would soon be. I felt a sudden, violent urge to stop, to break the pen, to scream a warning, to collapse the tunnel and end the cycle. But the mountain felt my rebellion. The jars on the shelves began to shatter. One by one, my remaining memories were extinguished. The smell of my first dog. The taste of salt on the skin after a day at the beach. The way the light looked in my bedroom when I was 6 years old. They were gone. Deleted. Replaced by the cold, hard geometry of the rules. I sat upright, my spine clicking like a stack of coins. I picked up the pen. My hand moved with a terrifying, autonomous precision. I wrote the final protocol. The exit. The choice. Upstairs, the tenant was moving. He had found the basement door. He was standing at the top of the stairs, staring into the dark. I could hear his heartbeat, a frantic, staccato rhythm that matched the ticking of the stopped clock. He was coming. He was coming to take the pen. And I was ready to finally sleep. The stairs didn't just creak under his weight, they groaned with the familiarity of a recurring nightmare. I watched from my seat at the desk, my faceless head tilted toward the ceiling, tracing the path of his descent. He was moving slowly, his hands shaking so violently that I could hear his fingernails rattling against the cedar banister. He was terrified of the dark, but he was more terrified of the light he had left behind, the flickering, static-filled reality of the hallway. Step by step, he neared the concrete floor. Each movement was a victory for the mountain. I felt the 8th peak press its invisible weight against the cabin's exterior, a massive, obsidian pressure that forced the very air out of the rooms above. The tenant reached the bottom and stopped. He stood there in the absolute blackness, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. He was waiting for a jump scare, for a monster to scream out of the shadows, but the mountain is more patient than that. It doesn't want your heart to stop, it wants it to beat faster and faster until the rhythm becomes a drum for the earth to dance to. I reached out and brushed my fingers against the small, charred door behind the water heater. It swung open without a sound. A faint, indigo light spilled out, not enough to illuminate the basement, but just enough to show him the way. It was a trail of breadcrumbs made of radioactive shadows. I heard him gasp. I heard the sound of his knees hitting the tacky, blood-stained floor as he began to crawl. He entered the tunnel. The moment his body was fully inside the throat of the peak, I felt a surge of energy move through the pen. The bone-white barrel grew hot, almost searing my necrotic flesh. I began to write faster. The words were no longer just rules, they were descriptions of the tenant's own internal anatomy. I wrote about the way his adrenaline was souring in his veins. I wrote about the specific shade of gray his soul was turning as the tunnel began to digest his hope. "Please," he whispered. The tunnel walls, lined with the shoes of the forgotten, seemed to lean in to catch the sound. "Is anyone there?" I did what the paper said. I counted the peaks. I hummed the song. "I just want to go home." I felt a hollow, rattling vibration in my chest, a laugh that had no voice. Home. The word was a foreign language to me now. I looked at the jars on the shelves, the ones containing my own stolen life, and saw that they were almost empty. The blue flames had turned to gray ash. There was no home. There was only the peak, and the ledger, and the endless, swaying rhythm of the obsidian needle. As he crawled, I began to manifest the final obstacles. I made the walls of the tunnel narrower, forcing him to exhale just to squeeze his ribs through the organic gaps. I made the scent of lilacs so thick that he began to gag, the floral sweetness coating his tongue like syrup. I wanted him to be desperate. I wanted him to arrive at the desk not as a man, but as a broken animal seeking any hand to lead it. The scratching beneath him intensified. The chorus of voices the previous curators began to chant his name. "Christian. Christian. The ink is wet. The mountain is cold." He burst into the chamber, collapsing onto the black liquid floor. He didn't look up at the swirling gray vortex or the infinite shelves of jars. He only saw me. Or rather, he saw the back of himself. He saw the frayed sweater, the slumped shoulders, the familiar shape of a man who had given up. I didn't move. I kept writing, the nib of the pen screeching against the parchment like a knife on bone. I could feel him staring at the back of my head. I could feel his confusion, his dawning realization that the guest in the hallway hadn't been a ghost, but a premonition. "You," he breathed. It's me." I stood up. The movement was a symphony of dry clicks and snapping tendons. I didn't turn around, but I held the pen out over my shoulder. The bone-white barrel glinted in the indigo light. I felt the mountain hold its breath. The eighth peak stopped its swaying, leaning down until its shadow covered the entire valley, waiting for the transition. The tenant reached out. His hand was trembling, his fingers slick with the blood of the floor. He hesitated for a second, a final spark of human will flickering in his eyes. But then, the mountain spoke. It didn't use words, it used the sound of the wind, a low-frequency hum that vibrated the very atoms of his brain. It showed him the alternative, an eternity of being chased through the static, a life of counting peaks that only led to madness. His fingers closed around the pen. The moment he took it, I felt a sensation of incredible lightness. The ink that had been flowing through my veins began to reverse, pouring out of my eyes and mouth, returning to the black liquid of the floor. My skin, once parchment tough, began to dissolve into a fine, gray dust. I was finally being unwritten. I looked at the jars on the shelves one last time. They weren't ash anymore. For a brief, fleeting second, they flared with brilliant, blinding light. I remembered the lake. I remembered the rain. I remembered the name of the girl I had loved before the mountain took my memory. I turned my head to look at him as I faded. He was sitting in the chair now. He was staring at his own hands as they began to turn the color of old paper. He looked at the ledger, at the empty space beneath my signature. He picked up the pen and began to write. Rule 1, the horizon check. As I dissolved into a cloud of black moths and drifted up into the gray vortex, I heard his voice, my voice, whisper into the ventilation ducts of the cabin far above. A new car was already turning into the driveway. The gravel was crunching. The sun was setting. And the eighth peak was waiting to be counted. The black moths that were once my soul didn't fly toward heaven, they drifted through the ceiling of the chamber, passing through layers of cold granite and ancient, fossilized bone until they reached the floorboards of Unit 44. I was no longer a man, nor even a curator. I was the atmosphere. I was the chill that settled in the corners of the rooms and the pressure that made the windows rattle in their frames. From my new vantage point as a ghost of the mountain, I watched the transition of power. Below, in the indigo dark, the new Christian sat at the desk. He didn't scream anymore. The pen had a way of silencing the voice. It demanded all of a person's breath for the ink. I watched his fingers, my fingers, cramp around the bone-white barrel as he began to elaborate on the rules. He was adding things I hadn't even thought of. He wrote about the basement hum, a sound that vibrates the teeth until they fall out. He wrote about the third eye in the wood, a knot in the cedar wall that blinks when you turn your back. The mountain was pleased, its new scribe was creative in his suffering. Above him, in the world of light and air, the next tenant arrived. This one was different. A woman, older, with eyes that had already seen too much grief. She didn't look at the cabin with wonder, she looked at it with suspicion. She carried a heavy flashlight and a heavy heart. I felt her footsteps on the porch, a solid, rhythmic thumping that sent tremors down into the basement chamber. "Is someone here?" she called out. Her voice was sharp, a blade of reality cutting through the thick, lilac-scented air. The cloud of moths, settled in the rafters above her head. I wanted to warn her. I wanted to scream that the clock behind her was about to stop, that the eighth peak was already leaning over the ridge like a hungry scavenger. But my only voice was the creak of the wood. I leaned my weight into the floorboard. Creak. She froze. She swung her flashlight toward the hallway, the beam of light cutting through the shadows like a physical object. The light was agony to me. It smelled of ozone and electricity, the very things Rule 7 warned against. I retreated into the dark, pulling the shadows with me. Downstairs, the new curator felt her presence. He paused his writing, the nib of the pen hovering over the parchment. I felt his hunger. It was a cold, parasitic need to see his own terror reflected in someone else's eyes. He began to hum. It wasn't the song of the bird in the cage. It was a low, guttural drone that vibrated through the pipes of the house. The woman moved toward the kitchen. She was looking for the source of the sound. She passed the wall clock. I watched as the brass hands shuddered, fought against the gravity of the mountain, and finally succumbed. Click. 4:44 p.m. She stopped. She heard the click. Slowly, with a hand that didn't tremble nearly as much as mine had, she reached up and took the clock off the wall. She saw the yellowed paper. She saw the cramped, black handwriting that was still wet in places, ink that had been blood only minutes before. She didn't read it silently. She read it aloud, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. The horizon check. The kettle rule. The mirror's guest. As she spoke the words, the rules became real. The kitchen began to whistle. The air began to smell of wet copper. The eighth peak rose from the valley floor, its obsidian skin reflecting the dying light of the sun. She looked out the window, counting the peaks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, she whispered. She paused. She saw the needle-thin spire swaying in the wind. She didn't blink. She stared at it with a defiant, burning intensity. 8. The peak didn't move. For the first time in a century, the eighth peak met someone who didn't flinch. The mountain shuddered. Below, the curator dropped the pen. The black liquid on the floor began to boil. I felt myself being pulled back down, the moths of my spirit being sucked into the vortex of the chamber. The woman didn't follow the rules. She didn't close the curtains. She didn't hum a nursery rhyme. She walked to the kitchen, grabbed a heavy iron skillet, and smashed the whistling kettle off the stove. Then, she walked to the bathroom and shattered the fogged mirror with the butt of her flashlight. I am not playing your games, she shouted into the empty air. The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't the silence of the mountains, it was the silence of a predator that had been slapped in the face. The eighth peak began to scream a sound that was too high for human ears, but it shattered the glass of the northern window. I felt the chamber below begin to collapse. The shelves of memories were falling, the jars smashing against the floor, releasing a century of stolen lives in a brilliant, chaotic explosion of blue flame. The curator was screaming, his skin peeling away like burnt paper, the ink of his face running down his chest in black rivers. The woman stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by broken glass and the smell of ozone. She wasn't winning, she was just refusing to lose the way we had. But the mountain is a patient god. If it couldn't break her with rules, it would break her with the weight of the peak itself. The ground began to heave. The cabin tilted on its granite perch. The cedar walls groaned, the nails popping like gunshots. The woman fell to her knees, but she didn't let go of her light. You want my name, she screamed at the floor. Come and take it. Below, the curator reached out one last time. He wasn't reaching for the pen. He was reaching for the woman. He wanted to pull her down into the indigo dark, to make her the next link in the chain before the mountain swallowed us all. I saw the tunnel open beneath her feet. I saw the organic, pulsing throat of the peak waiting to receive her. And I, the last remnants of the man who was once Christian, made a choice. I didn't flow into the curtains or the floorboards. I flowed into her light. I became the electricity. I made the flashlight flare with a blinding, impossible radiance, a sun inside the cabin. The light hit the indigo dark of the tunnel and it burned. It smelled of scorched hair and ancient, rotted velvet. The tunnel shriveled. The curator was blasted back into the vortex, his faceless head dissolving into ash. The mountain roared in agony, the obsidian peak cracking from top to bottom, a jagged lightning bolt of white stone appearing in its center. The cabin slid. It tumbled off the cliff, a chaotic mess of glass and cedar falling into the bruised purple of the valley. I felt the woman's hand let go of the flashlight as the world turned upside down. We were falling. The eighth peak was crumbling. The cycle was breaking. And for one beautiful, terrifying second, the silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains was finally, truly, quiet.